Look at a map of Australia. See those state borders? Perfectly straight lines cutting through the continent like someone took a ruler to it. Now here's the problem. They're not straight, not even close. In fact, there's a spot where three states are supposed to meet, but there's a 127-meter gap between them. Two concrete pillars, standing alone in the desert, marking where surveyors just gave up. And that's not even the weirdest part. When European colonizers carved up Australia in the 1800s, they had a brilliant idea. Forget natural boundaries. Forget rivers and mountains. Just draw straight lines. Pick a longitude here, a latitude there, and boom, instant borders. On paper, it was genius. Clean, simple, scientific. South Australia's eastern border, the 141st meridian east. Queensland's southern border, the 29th parallel south. Western Australia meets the Northern Territory and South Australia at the 129th meridian. Perfect geometry, except for one tiny detail. Nobody could actually find these lines. Picture this. It's 1847. You're a surveyor in the Australian outback. Your job? Walk north for hundreds of kilometres and mark the 141st meridian east. Your tools? A chronometer, basically a fancy pocket watch, a theodolite, some chains, and astronomical observations that require you to spot specific stars at specific times. Oh, and it's 45 degrees Celsius. You're running out of water. Your equipment keeps breaking. Your chains expand in the heat, throwing off every measurement. Flash floods wash away your markers, and you're trying to calculate longitude, which requires knowing the exact time back in Greenwich, England, using a watch that loses accuracy every day. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. Everything went wrong. Let's talk about the border between South Australia and Victoria. This is where things get properly absurd. In 1847, two surveyors got the job, Henry Wade from New South Wales and Edward White from South Australia. They were supposed to survey the 141st meridian from Port Phillip Bay all the way north. They worked separately, different instruments, different methods. They'd compare notes and average their readings. By 1850, they'd finished. The border was marked, settlers moved in, towns were established, land was sold. Then, in 1868, someone decided to check their work. The 141st meridian they'd marked was 3.6 kilometres too far west. Not 3.6 metres. 3.6 kilometres. That's about 2.2 miles for those keeping track. Wade and White had basically invented a new longitude and called it 141 degrees east. Now you might think, okay, fix it. Move the border. But here's the thing. By 1868, that fake border had been there for 18 years. There were farms, towns. People had built entire lives on land they thought was in Victoria. You can't just tell someone, hey, surprise, you've been living in South Australia this whole time. Pack your bags. South Australia wasn't happy. They'd effectively lost about 1,300 square kilometres of territory, roughly 500 square miles. So they sued. The case dragged on for years. It went to the High Court in 1911, then the Privy Council in London in 1914. And you know what the court said? Too late. The border stays. Their reasoning? Victoria had accepted and settled the line. People had based their entire lives on it. Moving it would cause chaos. So today, Victoria's western border sits on that wrong line. Meanwhile, New South Wales' western border, which is supposed to be at 141 degrees east, sits about 3.6 kilometres to the east. If you thought that was weird, let me introduce you to Surveyor General's Corner. This is where Western Australia, South Australia, and the Northern Territory meet. Or rather, where they're supposed to meet. The border here is meant to be the 129th meridian east. In 1922, everyone agreed. The border will be at 129 degrees east. We'll survey it properly. Their method? Plant two fixed markers, one near Deakin in Western Australia, one near Wyndham, and survey north-south lines from each. Where those lines meet the 26th parallel south, that's the corner. Sounds good, right? Fast forward to 1963. Survey crews finally make it out to check the lines. And they don't meet. The two survey lines, both supposedly following the 129th meridian, are 127 metres apart, about the length of a football field. Now you'd think, just fix it, pick the right line. But which one is right? Both surveys were done carefully. Both used the best methods available. They just disagreed. So in June 1968, they did the most Australian thing possible. They erected two concrete pillars, 127 metres apart, and said, "There, that's the border." The eastern pillar, the only point that's technically in all three jurisdictions, is officially called Surveyor General's Corner. The western pillar just sits there, a monument to the fact that sometimes borders are more suggestion than science. If you visit today, you can stand between them. One foot in Western Australia, the other in a gap that technically belongs to everywhere and nowhere. Now you might be wondering, what about the New South Wales-Queensland border? Why does that one seem straighter? Good question. And the answer reveals a lot about why some borders work and others don't. When Queensland separated from New South Wales in 1859, they defined the border in three parts. First, a watershed line along the coast following the natural high ground. Second, a series of rivers, the Dumaresque and McIntyre. Third, and this is key, the 29th parallel south. That latitude line runs east-west. And here's the thing about latitude. It's much easier to measure than longitude. To find your latitude, you just need to measure the angle of the sun or stars above the horizon. You don't need to know what time it is in England. You don't need perfect chronometers, just a sextant and clear weather. So when surveyors marked the 29th parallel, they got it mostly right, mostly being the key word. Even the Queensland border has quirks. In 2001, modern surveys found about a 200-metre discrepancy around the town of Wallangarra-Jennings. The border was meant to slice right through the town, putting half in Queensland and half in New South Wales. But the original survey was just slightly off, so Jennings ended up entirely in New South Wales, when it was supposed to be in Queensland. By the time anyone noticed, Jennings had been a New South Wales town for over a century. Schools, post offices, local government, all New South Wales. So they left it. Same story with other small properties along the border. A few farms ended up on the wrong side. But rather than fight decades-long legal battles over a few acres of scrubland, both states just shrugged and moved on. The principle was always the same. Once people have settled somewhere, once they've built lives and communities, you don't redraw borders just because someone's great-great-grandfather miscounted his chain measurements. So why were these surveys so bad? It's easy to blame the surveyors, but honestly, they were doing the impossible. Longitude is hard. It's not like latitude, where you can just look at the stars and do some math. Longitude requires knowing the exact time at a reference point, usually Greenwich, England, and comparing it to local solar time. In the 1840s, this meant carrying chronometers across thousands of kilometers of desert. These were delicate instruments that lost accuracy over time. Every day of travel meant more drift. Every jolt, every temperature change, every bit of humidity, it all added up. And even when they had accurate time, they still needed clear weather for astronomical observations. Clouds? Dust storms? You're stuck waiting. The chains they used to measure distance were literal metal chains that expanded in heat and contracted in cold. They had to be recalibrated constantly based on latitude, because the Earth's curvature means a chain measures differently at different latitudes. Oh, and did I mention they were doing this in some of the harshest terrain on Earth? The Australian outback in summer can hit 50 degrees Celsius. Water sources were unreliable. Equipment broke. People got sick. One surveyor's journal describes having to abandon observations because mirages on the horizon made it impossible to sight distant landmarks. Another describes losing weeks of work when a flash flood washed away all their cairns. These weren't bad surveyors. They were regular people trying to do precision scientific work in absolutely brutal conditions with 19th century technology. Want to know how desperate Australian surveyors were to get longitude right? In the 1920s, still decades before GPS, they started using international wireless time signals. Radio stations in France and Britain would broadcast synchronized time signals. Australian surveyors would set up radio receivers in the outback, pick up these signals, and use them to set their chronometers. Imagine, sitting in the middle of the Australian desert, antenna pointed at Europe, trying to catch a scratchy radio signal that would tell you what time it was in Paris, so you could figure out where the hell the 129th meridian was. It's almost poetic. Colonial borders defined by European powers, measured using signals from European capitals, imposed on a land that had its own geography for tens of thousands of years. Here's the thing that makes all of this permanent. Australian courts have a clear principle. Once a border has been physically marked and accepted, it stays, even if it's wrong. The reasoning is actually pretty sound. Borders aren't just lines on a map, they're administrative realities. They determine which state's laws apply, which government collects taxes, which services you receive. Once people have organized their lives around a border, built towns, established governments, divided land, you can't just move it because someone realizes the original survey was off. It's the same principle used in property law. If you build a fence and your neighbor accepts it for long enough, that fence becomes the legal boundary, even if it's not exactly on the surveyed property line. So when South Australia argued they'd lost 1,300 square kilometres to Victoria, the courts basically said, yeah, but Victoria has been governing that land for 60 years. People live there as Victorians. You can't just take it back now. And when surveyors found the 127-metre gap at Surveyor General's Corner, they didn't try to pick one line as correct. They just marked both ends of the gap and called it a day. Not all border corners have these problems. By the way, Cameron Corner, where New South Wales, Queensland and South Australia meet, is exactly where it's supposed to be. Same with Powapple Corner and Haddon Corner. These were surveyed later, with better equipment and more careful methods. Survey teams were specifically sent to mark these critical points, and they took their time to get it right. The disasters, Wade White, Surveyor General's Corner, happened because they were done early, done fast, and done under pressure to open up land for settlement. Speed won over accuracy, and once the mistakes were made, they became permanent. So the next time you look at a map of Australia and see those clean, straight state borders, remember, they're not straight. There's a 127-metre gap where 3 states are supposed to meet. A corner underwater in the Murray River. Farms in New South Wales that should have been Queensland, and a 3.6-kilometre strip Victoria took from South Australia without meaning to. These borders look perfect, but they're really a patchwork of mistakes, compromises, and 2 lonely concrete pillars in the desert. And honestly, that's way more interesting than a straight line, because Australia's borders were drawn by people who'd never seen the land, surveyed by people doing their best with impossible tools, and kept because changing them would make things worse. They're not straight, they never were, and they never will be.